Tonight, we begin with something that hasn't happened in Russia since 1917, something that Vladimir Putin has spent his entire presidency trying to prevent, something that threatens not just his war in Ukraine, but his grip on power itself. Russian military officers are no longer following orders without question. They're no longer accepting Putin's strategic decisions as inevitable, and they're no longer willing to lead their men into a meat grinder for objectives they know are impossible to achieve. This isn't a coup, not yet, but it's something far more dangerous for Putin. It's the slow withdrawal of consent, the quiet refusal, the spreading realization among the men with guns that their commander-in-chief is leading Russia toward catastrophe, and that they, the generals, the colonels, the officers who spent decades serving the state, might be the only ones who can stop it. The trigger was NATO's declaration. When the alliance announced it would treat any further Russian provocations as potential Article 5 violations, when Poland said it would shoot down Russian aircraft without waiting for permission, when Trump himself confirmed that NATO would respond with lethal force, something broke inside the Russian military command structure, because every officer with a map and a calculator realized the same terrible truth at the same moment. Russia cannot fight NATO, not now, not with an army bleeding from 70,000 desertions, not with soldiers who refuse to advance, because they'd rather face a firing squad than one more drone strike. Not 1 to 2, the equipment is broken, and the other half is from the 1980s. And yet Putin keeps pushing, keeps testing, keeps taps, keeps ordering provocations that every general knows could spiral into the one war Russia absolutely cannot win. So the officers started doing something they've never done before. They started saying no, not loudly, not publicly, but in the ways that militaries have, of resisting orders they know will destroy them. Delays in execution, misunderstandings about objectives, sudden equipment failures right before planned operations, reconnaissance missions that somehow never quite locate the targets they're supposed to find. This is how military rebellions begin in the modern age, not with tanks rolling through Moscow, but with 1,000 small refusals, with officers who nod in meetings and then simply don't do what they've been told, with commanders who protect their men by sabotaging the missions that would kill them, with a general staff that starts operating as if their president's orders are suggestions rather than commands. Let me tell you what's really happening. Behind the walls of the Ministry of Defense, in the last 6 weeks, 3 separate operations Putin personally ordered have simply not occurred, not canceled, not postponed, just quietly allowed to die in the planning stages. One was supposed to be a massive drone strike on Polish logistics hubs. Another involved electronic warfare operations that would have jammed NATO communications across the Baltic states. The third was a coordinated naval exercise that would have put Russian submarines within striking distance of undersea cables connecting Europe to North America. All 3 operations reached the final planning stage. All 3 had resources allocated. All 3 had units designated and commanders assigned. And all 3, mysteriously, encountered insurmountable obstacles that made execution impossible. Equipment couldn't be moved because railways were undergoing unexpected maintenance. Specialized personnel were suddenly unavailable due to illness. Weather conditions became unfavorable and remained unfavorable for weeks on end. This is not coincidence. This is institutional resistance. This is a military establishment that has decided it will no longer execute orders that could trigger Article 5 and destroy Russia, and Putin knows it. He knows his generals are slow-walking his directives. He knows his colonels are finding excuses to avoid implementing his strategies. He knows the chain of command that he's relied on for 25 years is corroding from the inside. But here's what makes this moment truly explosive. Putin can't purge his officer corps. Not now, not in the middle of a war. Every general he arrests creates chaos in the command structure. Every colonel he replaces with a loyalist creates operational paralysis. The Wagner mutiny showed him what happens when you try to reorganize military leadership. During active combat, units become confused, authority becomes unclear, and suddenly you have armed groups that answer to nobody, which is infinitely more dangerous than armed groups that answer slowly. So Putin is trapped. He needs his military to execute increasingly risky operations against NATO But his military has concluded those operations are suicidal and has begun the quiet revolt of simply not doing them. He can't fire everyone without collapsing his war effort entirely, and he can't back down without appearing weak, which in Putin's Russia is a death sentence for your political career and possibly your life. The split isn't public yet. The generals aren't holding press conferences. The colonels aren't writing open letters. But if you know where to look, the evidence is everywhere. Orders are given and not followed. Directives are issued and ignored. Putin announces aggressive new military postures, and then nothing happens. The disconnect between what the Kremlin says Russia will do and what the Russian military actually does has become so large that Western intelligence agencies are struggling to understand. Who's actually in charge NATO knows. The intelligence they're receiving about Russian command dysfunction is detailed and specific. They know about the canceled operations. They know about the growing resistance among mid-level officers. They know that Putin's biggest strategic problem isn't Ukrainian resistance anymore, it's Russian reluctance. And they're quietly recalibrating their entire approach based on this intelligence, because if Russia's military won't follow Putin's orders to escalate, then NATO can be more aggressive in drawing red lines. If Russian generals are sabotaging operations they believe will trigger Article 5, then NATO can threaten Article 5 more explicitly, knowing the Russian military itself will act as an internal brake on Putin's aggression. The alliance isn't just deterring Russia anymore. Although it's encouraging, the fractures inside the Russian military establishment that make Putin's most dangerous orders impossible to implement. This creates a bizarre dynamic, where NATO and the Russian general staff have aligned interests. Both want to avoid Article 5 escalation. Both recognize that Putin's provocations are pushing toward catastrophic confrontation. Both understand that someone needs to stop Putin from stumbling into a war that will destroy Russia. And increasingly, the Russian generals realize that someone has to be them. The historical parallels are chilling. In 1917, Russian generals lost faith in the Tsar's ability to win World War I. They didn't overthrow him immediately. They just stopped implementing his orders effectively. They started making decisions without consulting him. They began operating the military as if the Tsar's input was optional. And when the revolution came, the military didn't defend him. They stood aside and let history happen. Putin understands his history better than anyone. Alex spent his entire career studying how the Soviet Union fell, how power collapsed, how militaries withdrew their support from leaders they no longer believed could protect the state. He knows the warning signs. He's seeing them now, and he's realizing that the very institution he built his power on, the military that guaranteed his control, might be the institution that ultimately refuses to follow him into the abyss. The officers aren't political dissidents. They're not liberals who dream of democracy. They're hardcore nationalists who believe in a strong Russia. But that's exactly what makes them dangerous to Putin, because they've concluded that Putin is making Russia weak, that his strategy has failed, that his war in Ukraine is destroying the military rather than strengthening it, and that his provocations against NATO are threatening the existence of the Russian state itself. When career officers whose entire lives have been dedicated to protecting Russia conclude that their president is the greatest threat to Russia's survival, you have the conditions for regime change. Not immediately, not tomorrow. But the social contract between Putin and the military, the agreement that they'll follow his orders, and he'll make Russia powerful, has been broken. And once that contract breaks, it can't be repaired tonight. Somewhere in Moscow, a general is sitting in his office, looking at an order from Putin that he knows will lead to disaster. Maybe it's another provocation against NATO that could spiral out of control. Maybe it's another meat assault in Ukraine that will kill thousands for a few hundred meters of worthless territory. Maybe it's a directive so disconnected from battlefield reality that implementing it would be tantamount to treason against Russia itself, and that general is making a choice, not the choice between loyalty and rebellion, the choice between following orders and saving Russia, between obeying Putin and protecting the state. And increasingly, Russian officers are deciding those aren't the same thing anymore. This is how empires end, not with dramatic revolutions, but with quiet refusals, not with tanks in the streets, but with orders that simply aren't executed, not with explicit rebellion, but with the slow withdrawal of consent by the men with guns, who realize their leader has lost his mind. Putin's army isn't marching against him. Not yet, but it's not marching for him anymore either. And in Russia, that might be even more dangerous.